Chapter 12. I stood frozen in the doorway, the captain's wristcom laying in my hand. The captain furrowed his brows and stood up, almost matching Pete's height.
I'm sorry, but I will have to verify your story. Commander Howitz is not going anywhere. You can stay here until we reach Sector 5140.
Excuse me, Miss Andi.
It was Gilder's voice from behind me, and I felt his hand laid politely on my shoulder. I realized then that I was in his way, and I scooted aside, feeling vaguely confused. Then I remembered why I had come here. "Your comm, Captain," I said, stepping forward. He reached out and took it, and I could see frustration behind his eyes. He liked Commander Howitz, and the cold insistence of these men clashed with his normal routine.
Thank you. You may go attend to sickbay now.
I nodded, wishing that I could in good conscience take that as a suggestion rather than a command to leave the room. But I had learned long ago that when the captain gave suggestions, they were to be obeyed, and so I turned and left, feeling my own frustration as the door slid closed behind me. I trudged to sickbay, wondering just what Pete had meant by saying Erasmus Howitz is a dangerous criminal. What had he done? Could these men have any motive for lying? And yet the captain clearly considered it at least a possibility, if not likely. My wristcom beeped as I walked down the hall, jolting me out of my thoughts. There was no reason for me to worry about it. It didn't concern me at all. All I needed to do right now was take care of sickbay so that the doctor could get his rest. Later, perhaps at dinner, I would talk to the captain about what had been happening with the doctor, the strange way he had been acting. The captain would know what to do. Only one of the cots was occupied when I walked in, but it was a serious injury. It was a lieutenant from recycling in the hold with a nasty gash in his leg. He had gotten it in the recyclators, and I tried to keep from grimacing after I cut the bloody pant leg away and saw that the cut ran down to the bone. This would require too much regen for a simple local anesthetic. I'd need a full-scale tranquilizer. An hour after I'd begun work on the man, I was still healing the muscle. Lost in concentration, I focused on positioning the tissue in place with gloved fingers, then injecting the regen shot and letting it work while I moved on to another section. This type of work was on the edge of my healing abilities, and I was glad there was nothing worse. If there had been, I would have had to call the doctor no matter what his state. "Miss Lloyd?" The voice startled me out of my focus for an instant, but I then took a deep breath and closed the last section of muscle. "I'm sorry, I can't talk right now. You'll have to wait until I'm finished here." I couldn't spare the brain power to wonder about the speaker or even try to identify the voice. It was a male. That was as much as I had time to notice before I started work closing the skin. This was easier than the muscle and would hold better, but it was still a difficult task, and I had to finish before the anesthetic wore off. When at last the cut was closed, only a long white line gave evidence of the cut, and I wrapped the leg in gauze to keep the tender muscle and skin from tearing during the rest of the regeneration. Then at last, sucking a deep breath through the mask that covered my mouth and nose, I stood up straight and pulled my gloves off, shut off the monitor, and pulled my mask down. Then I turned in the general direction the voice had spoken from. On one of the cots at the other side of the room sat August Howitz, his dark eyes wide. I smiled as I untied my medical tunic and pulled it off. "What is it?" "That looks hard," he said. "It is." I dropped the tunic in the laundry chute and the gloves and mask in the recyclator. Then I pulled my uniform jacket off a metal peg on the wall. "Is that all you needed?" "No, my father sent me to see if you were all right. He said he was supposed to meet you at lunch." At the mention of lunch, my stomach began rumbling. "What time is it?" "It's past 2:00. He stood as I walked towards him. "Can I get you something? You seem busy." I shook my head. "I'm done now, thanks. He'll have to rest for a while. Is your dad already at work?" "Yes." He fell into step beside me as I walked to the mess hall. "He said he'll talk to you later." Hungry as I was somewhat relieved that I'd missed my appointment. I had no strong desire to talk to Commander Howitz at the moment, though I was still curious about what he had to say to me. And I couldn't forget Pete's voice yelling, "Erasmus Howitz is a dangerous criminal." I sighed. "Is everything all right, Miss Lloyd?" August asked politely. "Yes," I lied. "I'm only tired." "My father seemed worried about you." "I know. I appreciate his concern, but I'm fine." He wasn't finished. "I think it had something to do with the men who came aboard earlier." I stopped, letting him go on a few steps before I hurried to catch up. This didn't seem to make sense. Worried about me because of our visitors? But they were here for him, weren't they? "What makes you say that?" I asked. He shrugged. "I don't know. He just asked if I'd seen the visitors and asked a lot of questions about them, then asked if they'd seen you, and then he said I should go check on you." Frowning, I walked into the mess hall. August stopped inside the doorway. "So, you're all right?" "I'm fine," I promised. "Tell your dad I'm all right, and I'll talk to him later." With a nod that was almost more like a bow, he walked away towards the elevator. I made a rush for the snack bar to get something to eat before it closed. Elmira was too busy to talk, so I grabbed a sandwich and some milk and hurried back to sickbay. When I got there, I dismissed the lieutenant to rest in his quarters, then I spread a napkin on the floor and sat cross-legged to eat. As I bit into the sandwich, I listened to the silence. There were no monitors active, no scanners running. More than that, there was no warm, gruff voice to comment on my work or banter with me or quiz me on medicine or theology. That was the loneliest part of the silence. I was so rarely lonely since we came to space.
"Miss Lloyd, isn't it?"
I jumped up, almost knocking my milk over, and looked around toward the doorway. There stood Pete and Sigmund, the newcomers. "That's my name," I said, brushing the crumbs off my jacket. "Can I help you?" Instead of immediately answering, Pete turned his head towards his shorter companion. Sigmund stood behind him, and in his hands was a small metal object about the size of a book, whirring. Nodding, he pushed a button on the object and it became silent. "That's her, all right?" This vague statement made me nervous, and I backed up a step or two. "May I help you?" I said more loudly, as if that would make him simply answer my question and leave. Instead, Pete took a step forward. Sigmund didn't move from the doorway. It was as if he were guarding the room. "We need to have a word with you, Miss Lloyd." Hand shaking, I moved a finger to the transmission button on my wrist comm, but he stopped me with a deep, strong voice. "Don't worry. We won't hurt you." I didn't move my finger, but he went on. "There's something you need to know, but you're going to have to promise not to tell anyone what I'm about to tell you." A shiver ran through me as I shook my head. "I can't promise that."
"Then I'm afraid we can't tell you."
"All right," I said, although part of me cried out at the thought of not knowing. His voice darkened in frustration. "You could be in serious danger, Miss Lloyd." All I could do was shake my head. There didn't seem to be any answer to that, but I would not make a promise I would not keep, and I would not keep any secret that these two had to offer. I'd kept enough secrets already. He turned back to look at Sigmund again. The smaller man raised one eyebrow in a way that seemed to speak of urgency. With an impatient sigh, Pete turned back to me again, his broad jaw more set than ever. "All right. You must know, but please, if you value your life, use discretion before you tell anyone else." I glanced up in the direction of the security camera in the corner of the room, and he spoke quietly. "We've taken care of that. There will be no record of this conversation." Taking a deep breath, I tried to listen calmly, though I kept one finger near my wrist comm. "Tell me." "Close the door," Pete ordered, and Sigmund obeyed. Then the larger man gestured to one of the cots, while Sigmund limped over to us with his peculiar lopsided walk. Slowly, I lowered myself to the cot, never taking my eyes off the two men. They sat across from me, and if it were not for my anxiety, I might have been tempted to laugh at the sight of the two of them, such different heights and aspects sitting side by side on the cot. But I neither laughed nor smiled. Contrary to my expectations, Sigmund began the explanation, his bright, high eyes glinting at me. "Is it true that your right patella is partially composed of some metallic substance?" I started back. That wasn't what I'd been expecting at all. "Yes," I answered. "And is it true that this metal was already in place when your current father found you?" For some reason, his use of the word current bugged me, but I replied in the affirmative, adding, "Why do you want to know?" At this point, Pete leaned in a little closer and spoke in a low tone. "We know something about that metal, Miss Lloyd." "How could you possibly—" "Let me finish." He sat back again and spoke seriously, mechanically, his thick jaw working through the words as if they were parts on an assembly line. Have you heard of Radialloy? I shook my head. I thought not. It was a very secret operation. He turned expectantly to Sigmet, who began speaking. Radialloy is very valuable. It was discovered over 20 years ago, a metal with extreme destructive abilities. In the hands of the right people, or the wrong people, as the case may be, its damage could easily rival that of the atomic bomb. He must have seen my eyes widen, for he nodded seriously. It's an alloy mined from the planet Condon, in the Gamma Quadrant of Sector 1641. Shortly after the mine was discovered, however, the planet's sun went nova, and the planet was destroyed, along with all the radialloy. Here he paused for too long, and I cleared my throat and asked, "But what does this have to do with—"
Mr. Pete interrupted me. Miss Lloyd, only one specimen of the alloy had been taken from the planet before it was destroyed. Those familiar with it never knew what had happened to the piece. But we have reason to believe that it was hidden somewhere no one would suspect, with the intention of being able to retrieve it later."
"Hidden," I stammered, trying to make sense out of the story.
"We believe that it was hidden in your knee."
For a moment, no one spoke. I kept perfectly still, trying to take in all that they had just said. It didn't make sense, did it? Could it really be true? That someone had hidden a dangerous metal in my knee and that they would be hunting it down, wanting it back? "Why did you say I was in danger?" I asked, noticing a tremble in my voice.
"Because some people would do anything to get their hands on it," Pete said. "Our supervisor wants it destroyed before anyone can get to it. We were sent to get it."
"But," I stammered, "I thought you said you were here to arrest Commander Howitz." "That's the other thing," Sigmet began, but at that instant the door slid open. I jumped, and the two men turned their heads in one motion.